The auctioneer's gavel hung in the air, suspended in that breathless moment before impact. Lot 847, a 6,500 square foot estate in North Scottsdale, custom built, infinity pool, mountain views, current outstanding balance $2 million. My father's house. The house where he told me I'd never amount to anything, where he erased me from every family photo, where he built his kingdom on the lie that blood meant loyalty. The auctioneer's eyes found mine across the courthouse steps. Going once. Going twice. I raised paddle number 47, and for the first time in 12 years, I smiled at the thought of my father. Not because I wanted revenge, because I'd finally learned that sometimes justice wears a price tag, and I just bought mine at a county foreclosure auction. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Jessica Morgan, and this is the story of how my father's cruelty became my catalyst, how his dismissal became my degree in resilience, and how the man who called me nobody taught me to become someone he could never ignore. But more than that, this is about what happens when the child you throw away learns to catch themselves, learns to build something stronger than your approval, learns that the opposite of love isn't hate. It's equity. And I owned all of his. 12 years ago, I stood in the circular driveway of the Morgan estate, the August heat radiating off imported Italian stone, my daughter Lily strapped into her car seat behind me, everything I owned packed into 7 cardboard boxes and 2 garbage bags. My father stood in the doorway of his study, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the valley, backlit like some sort of deity pronouncing judgment. He didn't come outside. He never came outside when there was something unpleasant to witness. Instead, he stood there, scotch in hand, and spoke loud enough for his voice to carry across the perfectly manicured lawn his landscapers tended every Tuesday and Friday. You've always been the mistake I couldn't fix, Jessica. Your mother knew it. I've known it. Now you're dragging that baby into your mess. You're nobody. You'll always be nobody. Don't come back here thinking family means something when you've got nothing to offer. Brenda, my stepmother, stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder in that practiced gesture of wifely support. She didn't say anything. She never did when it mattered. Her silence was its own kind of cruelty, the type that lets you know she agrees with every word but won't soil her hands by speaking them herself. Behind them, through the glass, I could see Trevor sprawled on the leather sectional, gaming headset on, completely unbothered by the scene unfolding in the driveway. Why would he care? He was the golden child, the son who mattered, the one who'd never had to prove his worth because his gender did it for him. I didn't cry. I learned early that tears were currency my father didn't accept. Instead, I loaded the last box into my decade-old Honda, the one with the broken air conditioning and the dent in the rear bumper from when I backed into a pole during my first week of pregnancy. I buckled Lily in, her tiny face confused by the heat and the tension she could feel but couldn't name. Then I drove down that long driveway, past the palm trees my father had imported from California, past the fountain he'd commissioned from some artist in Sedona, past the gate with the bronze M that stood for Morgan, for legacy, for everything I'd apparently failed to be. The apartment I found was in Tempe, a 1-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a complex called Desert Vista. Though there was no vista, just a parking lot and a dumpster and the constant hum of the freeway half a mile away. The walls were thin enough that I could hear my neighbor's television through the drywall, and the air conditioning unit rattled like it was trying to escape its housing. But it was mine. Nobody could take it from me. Nobody could use it as leverage or dangle it like a reward I hadn't earned. I worked during the day as a junior analyst for a commercial real estate firm downtown, the kind of entry-level position where they pay you just enough to keep you desperate and not quite enough to build anything resembling security. At night, after Lily fell asleep, I studied. I taught myself financial modeling, learned to read balance sheets the way some people read novels, memorized the foreclosure laws for Maricopa County until I could recite them in my sleep. My father had been right about one thing. I was nothing. But nothing is just a starting point, and I'd learned from the best how to build something impressive on a foundation of absolute disregard. The Phoenix real estate market in those years was a living thing, breathing in boom cycles and exhaling busts, and I learned to read its rhythms the way a musician learns to read sheet music. I started attending foreclosure auctions on my lunch breaks, watching who bid on what, learning to spot the properties that looked like disasters but held hidden value. I never bid. I couldn't afford to. But I studied those auctions like they were masterclasses, and in a way they were. Lily grew. She started kindergarten at the public school 3 blocks from our apartment, the one with the chain link fence and the playground equipment that had been installed sometime in the previous century. She never complained. She'd inherited something from me that I'd had to learn the hard way. The ability to find joy in small spaces, to make a home out of whatever walls surrounded you. On weekends we'd drive out to Papago Park and hike the easy trails, and she'd collect rocks that caught her eye, smooth desert stones that she'd line up on the windowsill of our apartment like tiny monuments to persistence. I didn't hear from my father. Not on Lily's birthday, not on Christmas, not when I finally scraped together enough for a down payment on a reliable car. The silence was absolute, the kind that makes you understand that some people can cut you out of their lives with surgical precision and never look back to check the wound. Brenda sent a card once, one of those generic things you buy in a box of 50, with a printed message about family and a $20 bill tucked inside. I sent it back. I didn't need her guilt money or her Hallmark sentiments. But Trevor, I heard about Trevor. Phoenix is a big city, but certain circles run small, and the real estate development world is one of them. My father had started him in the business, given him a title at Morgan Development Group, something like Vice President of Acquisitions, which meant he showed up to meetings when he felt like it and took credit for deals other people closed. I'd see his name in the business journal occasionally, always attached to some new venture that my father was funding, always described with words like innovative and visionary, when anyone who actually worked in the industry knew he was coasting on a last name and a father's checkbook. 3 years into my exile, I got my first promotion. Senior analyst. It came with a raise that let me move to a 2-bedroom apartment. One with air conditioning that didn't sound like it was dying and walls thick enough that I couldn't hear every conversation my neighbors had. I started building a reputation at Summit Capital Advisors for finding value in distressed properties, for seeing potential where others saw only problems. My boss, a sharp woman named Patricia Sullivan who'd clawed her way up from nothing and remembered what that climb felt like, took me under her wing. "You've got the instinct for this," she told me one afternoon, reviewing a proposal I'd put together for a strip mall in Glendale that everyone else had written off. "You see past the surface damage to the bones underneath. That's rare. Most people in this business only know how to read the pretty financials. You know how to read the truth." I thought about my father when she said that, about how he'd built his entire life on pretty financials, on the surface shine of success, on making sure everyone saw the custom suits and the luxury car in the house in North Scottsdale. I wondered if he'd ever learned to read the truth, or if he'd gotten so good at performing prosperity that he'd started to believe his own show. Lily turned 8, and I enrolled her in a better school, one where the playground equipment had been installed this decade and the teachers knew their students' names. She'd started bringing home drawings, always the same scene with variations. A house with a big yard, 2 stick figures holding hands, sometimes a dog. When I asked her about them, she'd shrug and say she was just drawing what she imagined. I never told her about the Morgan estate, about the grandfather who'd thrown us away, about the life we'd left behind. Some stories children don't need to carry. The summer Lily turned 9, Patricia called me into her office and closed the door. "I've been watching the foreclosure listings," she said, pulling up a file on her computer. "There's a property coming up for auction next month. High dollar, over-leveraged, owner in default." She turned the screen toward me. "Think you know it. The Morgan Estate. 847 North Silverado Trail, Scottsdale. 6,500 square feet. Built 2005. Custom everything. Current market value estimated at $6.8 million. Outstanding mortgage balance for $2 million. Owner Dennis Morgan. Status, 90 days past due. Foreclosure proceedings initiated." I stared at the listing, at the photo of the house I'd been expelled from, at my father's name in the owner field. Patricia watched me, her expression neutral but her eyes knowing. "I've pulled the financials on Morgan Development Group," she said quietly. "He's been borrowing against this property for years, funding projects that aren't penciling out, keeping up appearances while the foundation crumbles. The bank's patience has run out." "Why are you showing me this?" I asked, though I already knew. "Because you've built something here, Jessica. You've got capital, you've got credibility, and you've got the expertise to know this property is worth more than the debt against it." She paused. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And because I think you've earned the right to decide what happens next. I drove past the estate that weekend, something I hadn't done in 9 years. The gate was the same, the bronze M still gleaming in the desert sun. The palm trees had grown taller, their fronds rustling in the dry wind that swept down from the mountains. From the street, it still looked perfect, still looked like the kind of place where successful people live successful lives. But I'd learned to read past the surface, and what I saw now was different. The landscaping was slightly overgrown, the fountain wasn't running, and there was a crack in the driveway that hadn't been repaired. Small signs that money was getting tight, that maintaining the illusion was becoming harder. Lily sat in the passenger seat, her tablet in her lap, recording a video for some school project about architecture. She'd started doing that recently, filming everything, narrating her observations like a tiny documentarian. "Is that a nice house?" she asked, zooming in on the facade. "It's an expensive house," I told her. "That's not always the same thing." I spent the next 3 weeks doing what I do best. I pulled every financial record I could access legally, traced every loan my father had taken, mapped every property Morgan Development Group owned or had an interest in. The picture that emerged was stark. My father had spent the last decade borrowing against tomorrow to pay for today, leveraging the estate, the business, everything he'd built, to fund Trevor's failed ventures and maintain the lifestyle that kept him relevant in the circles he cared about. He was a house of cards in a desert windstorm, and the wind was picking up speed. Patricia helped me structure the financing. I had savings, I had equity in some smaller investments, and I had credibility with lenders who knew I didn't make reckless bids. The numbers worked. If I could acquire the property at auction for anything near the outstanding mortgage balance, I'd own a house worth $6.8 million for 4.2 instant equity, solid investment. But this wasn't about the investment, not really, and Patricia knew it. "You don't have to do this," she told me the night before the auction. "You've already proven everything you needed to prove. You've built a good life, a career, security for Lily. You don't need this to validate anything." "I know," I said. "But I want him to understand something. I want him to learn what I learned. That nobody is just a word someone uses when they're too afraid to see your potential. And I want to be standing there when he realizes that the nobody he threw away is the someone who owns his entire world." The auction was held on the courthouse steps downtown, the September heat bearing down like divine judgment, the kind of day where the air shimmers and every breath feels borrowed. There were maybe 30 people gathered, a mix of investors, attorneys, representatives from banks holding other liens. I stood toward the back, paddle number 47 in my hand, wearing a navy suit I'd bought specifically for this moment, expensive but understated, the kind of thing that signaled competence without flash. The auctioneer ran through the preliminaries, the legal description of the property, the terms of sale, the current outstanding balance. I watched the other bidders, calculating who was serious and who was just there to watch. There were 2 investors I recognized, both with deeper pockets than mine, both capable of outbidding me if they wanted to. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hand stayed steady. "Bidding opens at 4.2 million, the auctioneer announced. "Do I have 4.2? A paddle went up from a man in a gray suit. Then another. The price climbed slowly. 4.3, 4.4, 5. I waited. Patience in an auction is power, and I'd learned to wait until the moment mattered. At 4.7, one of the serious bidders dropped out. At 4.9, the other hesitated. The auctioneer's voice cut through the heat. "I have 4.9, do I hear 5? Silence. The kind that stretches and bends time. I could feel Patricia beside me, her presence steady. The man with the gray suit looked around, gauging the room, deciding if he wanted to go higher. The auctioneer raised his gavel. "Going once at 4.9 million. I raised my paddle. 5 million. The gray suit turned, saw me, frowned. He raised his paddle. 5.1. 5.2, I countered. He hesitated. I could see him doing the math, calculating margins, weighing risk against reward. The auctioneer's voice was relentless. "I have 5.2, do I hear 5.3? The man lowered his paddle and shook his head. The auctioneer scanned the crowd one final time. "Going once at 5.2 million. Going twice." His gavel came down with a crack that echoed off the courthouse facade. "Sold to bidder number 47. Patricia squeezed my shoulder. I stood there, paddle still in my hand, the sun beating down on the concrete, and felt something shift inside my chest. Not triumph exactly. Something quieter. Something like completion. I'd just purchased my father's house, the kingdom he'd built to prove his worth, the castle he'd defended by throwing me out of it, and he had no idea. Not yet. The paperwork took 2 weeks to finalize. Mortgage transfer, title work, inspections I waived because I didn't need them. I knew every inch of that property. Patricia handled most of it through our attorneys, keeping my name off anything public until the documents were recorded. I wanted the reveal to be clean, definitive, the kind of thing that left no room for interpretation or excuse. On a Thursday afternoon, Raymond Cooper, the real estate attorney Patricia had recommended, called my father's office and requested a meeting to discuss the property at 847 North Silverado Trail. My father, I later learned, assumed it was about refinancing, about finding some way to restructure the debt and keep the house. He agreed to meet that Friday at 2. I didn't plan to attend. This wasn't about confrontation or spectacle. I'd already won. The house was mine, recorded in the county records, legal and binding. But Raymond called me Friday morning and asked if I wanted to be there. Your choice, he said. But I think there's value in him understanding exactly who he's dealing with now. So I went. I wore the same navy suit, pulled my hair back in a simple twist, drove downtown to Morgan Development Group's office on Camelback Road. The building was all glass and steel, the kind of place designed to intimidate, to remind visitors that they were entering someone else's domain. The receptionist, a young woman with perfect makeup and a plastered smile, told me Mr. Morgan was expecting us and directed us to the conference room on the 3rd floor. The conference room had windows that overlooked the city, a long table of polished wood, chairs that probably cost more than my first car. My father sat at the head of the table, Trevor beside him, Brenda in a chair against the wall like an observer at a play. My father wore a charcoal suit, French cuffs, the Rolex he'd bought to celebrate some deal I didn't remember. He looked older than I remembered, the lines around his eyes deeper, his hair more gray than brown. But his expression was the same, that particular blend of arrogance and dismissal that he wore like cologne. He barely glanced at me when we entered. His eyes went to Raymond, assessing, categorizing. Mr. Cooper, I appreciate you coming in. I assume you're here representing the bank's interests in restructuring the Silverado property? Raymond set his briefcase on the table and pulled out a folder. Actually, Mr. Morgan, I'm here representing the new owner of 847 North Silverado Trail. The foreclosure sale was completed 2 weeks ago. The property has been transferred, and the previous mortgage has been satisfied. My father's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. The new owner, he repeated slowly. And who would that be? Raymond smiled, the professional kind that gave nothing away. My client prefers to introduce herself. I stepped forward, my hands folded in front of me, my voice steady. Hello, Dad. It's been a while. The silence that followed my greeting was the kind that has weight, the kind you can feel pressing against your chest. My father's face went through a series of micro-expressions, confusion to recognition to something that might have been shock if he'd allowed himself to show it. Trevor actually sat up straighter, his phone forgotten on the table in front of him. Brenda's hand went to her throat, fingers touching the pearl necklace she wore. A nervous gesture I remembered from years ago. Dennis Morgan didn't speak immediately. That was always his way, the calculated pause before responding, the deliberate silence meant to unsettle whoever had dared to challenge him. He'd used it in business negotiations, in family arguments, in every interaction where he needed to reassert control. I'd watched him deploy it 1,000 times growing up, seen people squirm under the weight of his wordless judgment. But I wasn't that frightened daughter anymore, and I'd learned something valuable in the years since he'd expelled me from his perfect world. Silence only has power if you're afraid to let it sit. So I waited. I stood there in my navy suit, my hands still folded, my expression neutral, and I let the quiet stretch between us like a bridge neither of us had built but only one of us knew how to cross. Raymond stood beside me, his briefcase open, documents arranged in neat stacks that represented the legal architecture of my father's downfall. Through the windows behind my father's head, I could see downtown Phoenix spreading out in the afternoon haze, buildings climbing toward a sky bleached white by heat and ambition. Jessica, my father finally said, And my name in his mouth sounded like an accusation. What kind of game is this? Not a game, I replied evenly. A transaction. A legal purchase of a property at a county foreclosure auction. All above board, all documented, all final. Trevor leaned forward, his face flushed. You bought our house? Dad, she can't do that. Tell her she can't do that. I turned my attention to my half-brother, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in over a decade. He'd put on weight, his jaw softening into the beginning of jowls, his eyes carrying the slightly glazed look of someone who'd never had to focus on anything difficult for very long. He wore an expensive watch, I noticed, probably a gift from our father, and his suit was tailored but wrinkled, as if he'd slept in it or simply didn't care enough to maintain appearances the way Dennis Morgan always had. Actually, Trevor, I said calmly. And I did. The property went into default after 90 days of non-payment on the mortgage. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings. It was listed for public auction, and I submitted the winning bid. The sale was completed 2 weeks ago and, as of last Tuesday, the deed was recorded in my name with the Maricopa County Recorder's Office. Brenda made a small sound, something between a gasp and a whimper. My father shot her a look, sharp and cutting, and she pressed her lips together, her hand still clutching at her pearls. I wondered if she understood yet what this meant, if she could see past the immediate shock to the implications beneath. Probably not. Brenda had always been good at surface-level responses, at performing the emotions expected of her, but I'd never seen evidence that she thought deeply about consequences or futures beyond the next social event. My father stood slowly, his movements controlled and deliberate. He was still tall, still commanding in the way that men who've spent decades being obeyed often are, and I could see him reaching for the authority he'd always assumed was his by right. You had no right, he said, his voice low and tight. That house has been in this family for 20 years. I built that house. Everything in it, everything it represents, that's mine. Was yours, Raymond corrected gently, stepping forward. Past tense, Mr. Morgan. The mortgage was in default. The bank exercised its legal right to foreclose. The property was sold at public auction to satisfy the debt. Your daughter submitted the winning bid and completed the purchase. The house and everything attached to it now belongs to her. My father's jaw worked, muscles clenching beneath skin that had gone slightly pale. I could see him processing this, trying to find the angle, the leverage point, the way to regain control of a situation that had already slipped completely from his grasp. This was a man who'd spent his entire adult life making things bend to his will, who'd built a career on dominating negotiations and intimidating opponents. But real estate law doesn't care about intimidation, and county records don't respond to force of personality. There has to be something, my father said, looking at Raymond now, dismissing me as if I were simply a proxy, a messenger delivering someone else's verdict. A legal challenge. This was my primary residence. There are protections for homeowners in foreclosure. My attorney should have been notified. Your attorney was notified, Raymond said, pulling a document from his briefcase. Certified letter, sent to the address on file with the bank, received and signed for by someone at your office on July 15th. That was 63 days before the auction. Arizona law requires a minimum of 90 days notice before foreclosure sale. You were given 106 days. He slid the document across the table. My father didn't look at it. Trevor grabbed it instead, his eyes scanning the page with an expression that suggested he was reading words but not comprehending meaning. This is crazy, Trevor muttered. Dad, tell them this is crazy. We'll sue. We'll fight this. On what grounds? I asked quietly. The foreclosure was legal. The auction was public. The sale was legitimate. I paid $5.2 million for a property with an outstanding mortgage balance of $4.2 million. I satisfied your debt, Dennis. You should be thanking me. Without that sale, the bank would have come after you for the deficiency, and given the other liens I've seen filed against Morgan Development Group, I don't think you're in a position to weather that particular storm. My father's eyes finally met mine, really met them, and I saw something I'd never seen there before. Not anger, not dismissal, but something closer to comprehension. He was beginning to understand that this wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding or something he could talk his way out of. This was done. Finished. Real. How did you even, he started then stopped. The question hung incomplete in the air between us. How did I what? How did I find out about the foreclosure? How did I have the money to bid? How did I become someone capable of outmaneuvering him at his own game? The answer to all of those questions was the same. I learned. I grew up. I became everything you said I'd never be. And I did it without your help, without your approval, without your name opening doors I had to kick down myself. I've been working in commercial real estate for 11 years, I said, answering the question he hadn't finished asking. I started as a junior analyst and worked my way up. I learned to read financial statements, to spot distressed properties, to understand foreclosure law. I built a career on finding value where other people only saw problems. When I saw your property come up for auction, I did my due diligence. I reviewed the financials on Morgan Development Group. I traced the loans you've taken against the estate. I calculated the risk versus reward. And I decided it was a sound investment. Investment, my father repeated. And the word seemed to catch in his throat. You bought my house as an investment. I bought a piece of real estate at a foreclosure auction, I corrected. The fact that you happen to be living there is incidental to the underlying value of the property. Though I'll admit there was a certain poetic symmetry to it, given our history. Brenda stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. You can't just throw us out, she said, her voice climbing toward hysteria. We have rights. We have belongings in that house. Dennis, tell her she can't just throw us out. I'm not throwing anyone out, I said calmly. Not yet anyway. Arizona law provides for a redemption period after foreclosure sale. You have 180 days from the date of auction to redeem the property by paying the full purchase price plus interest and costs. That would be $5.2 million plus accrued interest at the statutory rate, which works out to roughly $5.3 million if you can secure the funds within the next 5 months. My father laughed, a short, bitter sound. You know, I don't have that kind of liquidity. If I did, the property never would have gone into foreclosure in the first place. I nodded. I assumed as much. Which means you have 6 months to make arrangements to vacate the premises. I'm not unreasonable. I understand moving takes time, especially when you have 20 years of accumulated possessions. But I will expect the property to be vacated and turned over in clean condition by the end of the redemption period. Trevor slammed his hand on the table, making Brenda jump. This is such bullshit. You're doing this because you're petty and vindictive and you never got over Dad not treating you like you were special. Guess what, Jess? You weren't special. You were a burden, and now you're just a vindictive bitch with a grudge. I turned to look at my half-brother, at this man-child who'd been handed everything and accomplished nothing, who'd coasted through life on our father's money and name and never once questioned whether he deserved any of it. I felt nothing looking at him, no anger, no hurt, just a mild curiosity about how someone could reach nearly 30 years old and still have the emotional sophistication of a spoiled teenager. Trevor, I said evenly, I haven't thought about you in years. This isn't about petty grievances or old wounds. This is about real estate. This is about a distressed property that came up for auction, and I had the capital and expertise to acquire it. Your feelings about it are as irrelevant as your opinions have always been. Raymond cleared his throat gently. If we could return to the practical matters at hand. Ms. Morgan, as the new property owner, has certain rights and responsibilities. You, as the former owners and current occupants, also have rights under Arizona law. I'd suggest you retain counsel to review your options and ensure a smooth transition. My father was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Something had shifted in his face, some recognition or realization dawning behind his eyes. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, stripped of some of the bluster that usually armored it. When I said those things to you 12 years ago when I told you to leave, he paused, seeming to search for words. I thought I was doing the right thing. You were 26 years old, divorced, with a baby, no plan, no prospects. I thought tough love would motivate you to get your life together. I thought you needed to understand that the world wasn't going to hand you anything just because you were my daughter. I let his words hang in the air for a moment, examining them for sincerity, for actual remorse, for any indication that he understood the cruelty embedded in what he'd done. I found none. What I heard instead was justification, the same kind of retroactive reasoning people use when they need to make their past actions seem noble instead of simply mean. You told me I was nobody, I said quietly. You said I was the mistake you couldn't fix. You said I'd always be nothing. That wasn't tough love, Dennis. That was just cruelty dressed up in parental authority. And you were wrong. I'm not nobody. I'm the person who just bought your house out from under you. I'm the person who built a career and a life and a future for my daughter without your help or your money or your name. I'm the person standing here right now with the deed to your estate in my briefcase and 6 months' worth of mortgage payments in my bank account. So no, you weren't doing the right thing. You were just being cruel because you could be, because I was vulnerable and you had power, and that's what men like you do with power. Brenda was crying now, quiet tears running down her carefully made-up face, smearing her mascara in dark tracks. Trevor had slumped back in his chair. His earlier bluster deflated into something sullen and resentful. My father stood very still, his hand resting on the back of his chair, his knuckles white where he gripped the leather. What do you want? He asked finally. There has to be something. You didn't go through all this trouble just to evict me and sell the house. So what is it? Money? An apology? What do I have to do to make this go away? I felt something crack open in my chest. Not anger but something sadder. Something that mourned the relationship we'd never had and never would have. He still didn't understand. Even now, facing the consequences of his own financial mismanagement and my legitimate purchase of a foreclosed property, he thought this was about leverage, about negotiation, about finding the price point where I'd back down and let him keep his kingdom intact. I don't want anything from you, I said, and meant it with every cell in my body. I wanted something from you 12 years ago. I wanted a father who believed in me. I wanted support when my marriage fell apart. I wanted someone to tell me I could survive and build something better. I wanted you to meet your granddaughter and tell her she mattered. But I don't want any of that anymore because I found it elsewhere. I found it in myself. I found it in the people who helped me when you threw me away. I found it in every foreclosure auction I studied, every financial model I built, every property I analyzed. I found it in proving that your assessment of me was wrong. So no, Dennis, I don't want anything from you. I already have everything I need, including your house. Raymond began gathering the documents, sliding them back into his briefcase with efficient movements. I'll have my office send over the formal notice to vacate, along with information about the redemption period and your rights as occupants. If you'd like to discuss a structured timeline for moving, my client is willing to be reasonable about the logistics. But the underlying facts aren't negotiable. The property has been sold. The transaction is complete. I turned to leave, then paused, one final thing occurring to me. There's a collection of photographs in the study, I said. Family photos, most of them from before my mother died. I'd like those. Not the frames, just the photographs themselves. Particularly any that include her or me. I'll send someone to collect them once you've had a chance to sort through things. Everything else in the house, the furniture, the art, whatever personal possessions you've accumulated, those are yours to take when you move. I'm only interested in the structure and the land. My father nodded slowly, and for just a moment, I saw something in his face that might have been regret. Or maybe just the beginning of understanding that actions have consequences, that cruelty compounds over time, that the daughter he'd dismissed as nobody had become someone formidable enough to dismantle his carefully constructed world. We left the office building and stepped into the Phoenix afternoon, the heat hitting like a physical force after the air-conditioned chill of the conference room. Raymond walked beside me to the parking garage, his briefcase swinging gently at his side. That went about as well as could be expected, he said mildly. He'll likely consult with an attorney, have someone review everything we've presented. But I don't anticipate any legitimate legal challenges. The foreclosure was by the book, the auction was public and properly noticed, and your purchase was clean. He might bluster, might threaten, but there's no grounds for reversal. I nodded, feeling strangely empty now that the confrontation was over. I'd imagined this moment for weeks, played out various scenarios in my mind, rehearsed different things I might say. But the reality had been quieter than my imaginings, less dramatic, more sad than satisfying. How do you feel? Raymond asked, stopping beside my car. I considered the question honestly. Tired, I said finally. Like I just finished something that needed finishing. But there's no real joy in it. Is that strange? He smiled, the kind of smile that suggested he'd seen this exact reaction before. Not strange at all. Justice doesn't always feel triumphant. Sometimes it just feels like closing a door that should have been closed a long time ago. I drove back to my office in downtown Phoenix, my mind replaying the scene in the conference room. cataloging details I hadn't fully processed in the moment. The way my father's hand had trembled slightly when he gripped the chair. The mascara tracks on Brenda's face. Trevor's sullen incomprehension. His inability to understand that the world didn't actually owe him anything just because he'd been born into the right family with the right last name. Patricia was waiting in my office when I arrived, sitting in one of the chairs facing my desk, her reading glasses perched on her nose, a stack of documents in front of her. She looked up when I entered, her expression expectant. "Well," she said simply. "It's done," I replied, sinking into my desk chair. Raymond presented the documentation. My father was shocked, then angry, then tried to negotiate. I told him there was nothing to negotiate. He has 6 months to vacate. "How did it feel?" Patricia asked, and I appreciated that she didn't assume to know, didn't project her own expectations onto my experience. "Like closing a very old, very heavy book," I said. "Not satisfaction exactly. More like completion. Like finishing something I started 12 years ago without knowing I'd started it." Patricia nodded slowly. "That's probably healthy. Revenge that feels good is usually the kind that eats at you later. Revenge that just feels necessary, that's different. That's just setting boundaries that should have existed all along." "Is this revenge?" I asked, genuinely curious what she thought. She considered for a moment, removing her glasses and setting them on my desk. "I think revenge is when you act to cause harm for its own sake. You didn't cause your father's foreclosure. You didn't create his financial problems or force him to over-lever his properties. You just took advantage of a legitimate market opportunity that happened to involve someone who'd wronged you. If the property had belonged to a stranger, you still would have bid on it because the numbers made sense. The fact that it belonged to your father just made it personally meaningful in addition to financially sound. That's not revenge. That's just good business with emotional resonance." I pulled up my email, scanning through the messages that had accumulated during the meeting. There was one from Lily's school, reminding parents about the upcoming fall festival. One from a colleague asking about a property in Chandler. One from a sender I didn't recognize with a subject line that read, "Regarding recent property acquisition." I opened it, my stomach tightening slightly. The email was from an address I didn't know, but the signature at the bottom identified the sender as Marcus Webb, attorney at law, representing Dennis and Brenda Morgan. The message was brief and professionally worded. It requested copies of all documentation related to the foreclosure and auction, stated that my father was exploring all legal options, and suggested a meeting to discuss potential irregularities in the sale process. I forwarded it to Raymond with a simple note. "Expected pushback. Please respond as appropriate." Within 10 minutes he'd replied. "Already on it. There are no irregularities. Let them waste money on a fishing expedition if it makes them feel better." That evening, I picked Lily up from her after-school program and drove us back to our apartment in Central Phoenix. We'd moved last year to a nicer building, one with a pool and a gym and actual sound insulation between units, but I hadn't felt ready to buy something yet. Some part of me had still been waiting, still holding capital in reserve for an opportunity one couldn't quite name but knew I'd recognize when I saw it. Now I understood what I'd been waiting for. "Mom," Lily said from the back seat, her tablet in her lap as always, "you seem different today. Happy but also kind of sad. Did something happen?" I glanced at her in the rearview mirror, at this 9-year-old person who noticed things, who paid attention, who'd inherited my ability to read emotional undercurrents even when people tried to hide them. "Something big happened," I told her. "Something I'll explain when you're older and can understand all the pieces. But the short version is that I did something today that was hard but necessary, and now something that was broken for a long time is finally fixed." She nodded, seeming to accept this explanation even though it was vague. "Is the broken thing going to affect us?" she asked. "Like, are we moving or changing schools or anything?" "No, honey," I assured her. "If anything, our life just got more stable, more secure. I made an investment that's going to pay off for both of us." That night, after Lily was asleep, I sat at my kitchen table with a glass of wine and my laptop, pulling up the property records for 847 North Silverado Trail. There it was, officially recorded. Owner Jessica Morgan. Purchase price $5,200,000. Date of sale September 23rd. It was real, legal, binding. I thought about my father in that house tonight, probably pacing his study, probably calling his attorney, probably trying to find some angle that would undo what had been done. I thought about Brenda, likely in bed with a headache and a sleeping pill, unwilling to face the implications. I thought about Trevor, possibly still at his parents' house, possibly out at some bar spending money he didn't have, refusing to acknowledge that his safety net had just been pulled away. The following morning, I woke to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. Most were from numbers I didn't recognize, but 3 were from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, people who existed on the periphery of my father's world and had never once reached out when I needed help or support. I made coffee and scrolled through the messages while standing at my kitchen counter, the early light filtering through the blinds in pale stripes. The texts followed a predictable pattern: shock, disbelief, thinly veiled accusations. My father's cousin Gerald, who I'd met exactly twice in my life, wrote that family should support family, not tear each other down. My stepmother's sister Diane sent 3 paragraphs about forgiveness and Christian values, which was rich considering she'd never said a word when my father threw me out 12 years ago. Trevor had sent a series of increasingly incoherent messages between 2 and 4 in the morning, calling me various names and threatening legal action that he clearly didn't understand and certainly couldn't afford. I deleted them all without responding. There was nothing to say, no explanation that would satisfy people who'd already decided I was the villain in a story they didn't fully understand. They wanted me to be the ungrateful daughter seeking revenge, because that narrative was simpler than acknowledging that my father had created this situation through his own financial mismanagement and cruelty. It was easier to blame me than to examine the choices that led to a foreclosure auction in the first place. Patricia called while I was getting Lily ready for school. She'd seen the property transfer recorded and wanted to make sure I was prepared for what came next. The vultures will circle, she warned. Extended family, business associates, people who owe your father favors or think they can broker some kind of reconciliation. They'll all come with their hands out or their opinions ready. You need to be clear about your boundaries now, before this turns into a circus. I'm not interested in negotiations, I told her, braiding Lily's hair while balancing the phone between my shoulder and ear. The property is mine. I'll give them the full redemption period as required by law, but I'm not selling it back at a discount or accepting some kind of payment plan. If Dennis wants to keep the house, he needs to come up with $5.3 million. Otherwise, he needs to start packing. After dropping Lily at school, I drove to the office and found a small crowd of reporters waiting in the lobby. Apparently someone had leaked the story to the local business press, and they were eager for the dramatic angle. Real estate developer loses mansion to estranged daughter. It had all the elements of a good headline: family drama mixed with financial intrigue, and a hint of poetic justice. I slipped in through the parking garage entrance and took the service elevator, avoiding them entirely. Raymond called mid-morning with an update. Marcus Webb had sent over a formal request for all documentation related to the foreclosure process. It was standard posturing, the kind of thing attorneys do when their clients demand action, but there's no actual legal basis for a challenge. Raymond had already prepared a comprehensive response, including copies of the foreclosure notice, proof of publication, auction records, and the certified letters sent to my father's office and home address. They're going to push on the notification, Raymond said. Try to argue that your father didn't receive proper notice, or didn't understand the implications. But we have signatures, dates, tracking numbers. Unless they want to argue that your father is incompetent to manage his own affairs, which would open up a whole other set of problems for him, they don't have a case. Let them waste their time, I said. I have documentation going back 5 years showing every tax payment, every maintenance expense, every insurance premium on that property. If they want to argue I shouldn't own it, they'll have to explain why my father let it fall into foreclosure while I was paying more attention to its upkeep than he was. The week unfolded in a strange rhythm of normalcy punctuated by surreal intrusions. I went to work, analyzed properties, attended meetings, reviewed financial models. But underneath the routine, there was a constant hum of awareness that something fundamental had shifted. I owned my father's house. That fact sat in my consciousness like a stone, heavy and solid and undeniable. Lily had started asking questions. Not direct ones, she was too intuitive for that, but sideways inquiries that let me know she sensed something significant was happening. At dinner on Wednesday, she looked up from her homework and asked if we'd ever lived in a big house. I told her we had, briefly, when she was a baby, but that it hadn't been ours. She nodded and went back to her math problems, but I could see her processing, filing away information for later consideration. Thursday afternoon, Brenda called. Her number showed up on my phone, and I stared at it for 3 rings before deciding to answer. Her voice, when I picked up, was thin and fragile, stripped of the performative cheerfulness she usually wore like makeup. "Jessica," she said, and then seemed to run out of words. I waited, listening to her breathe on the other end of the line. Finally, she continued. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me. I know I didn't, when your father asked you to leave, I should have said something. I should have stood up for you. But you didn't," I said flatly. "You stood next to him and said nothing while he threw his daughter and granddaughter into the street. So forgive me if this sudden attack of conscience doesn't move me." "I deserve that," she said quietly. "I deserve worse than that, probably. But Jessica, please, this house, it's all we have. Your father put everything into Morgan Development and the market turned, and the projects didn't work out, and now we're going to lose everything. If you take the house, we'll have nothing. We'll be homeless." I felt a flicker of something that might have been sympathy, quickly extinguished by memory. "Homeless," I repeated. Like I was when I moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in Tempe with a newborn and $700 in my checking account? Like that kind of homeless? "That's not fair," Brenda protested weakly. "Fair," I said, and laughed without humor. "You want to talk about fair? You live in a 6,000 square foot house that I helped maintain while building my career from nothing. You wear designer clothes and belong to country clubs and take vacations to Europe. I worked 60-hour weeks while raising a daughter alone so I could build the kind of security you took for granted. Don't talk to me about fair, Brenda. You wouldn't recognize it if it foreclosed on your mortgage." There was silence on the line. Then the sound of muffled crying. I waited, unmoved. I'd cried plenty in the years after my father expelled me, cried while paying bills I could barely afford, cried while explaining to Lily why we couldn't buy the things other kids had, cried alone in the dark after putting her to bed and facing another day of building something from nothing. Brenda's tears now felt like currency I had no interest in accepting. "The redemption period is 180 days, I said finally. "That gives you 6 months to find alternative housing. I suggest you start looking now. Properties move quickly in this market, and the longer you wait, the fewer options you'll have." "Jessica, please," Brenda tried one more time. "Your father is a proud man. This is going to destroy him." "My father is a cruel man," I corrected. "And he destroyed me first. Or he tried to anyway. The fact that I survived and built something better isn't my fault. It's my accomplishment. Now if you'll excuse me, I have actual work to do." I hung up before she could respond, my hand shaking slightly as I set the phone down on my desk. Patricia appeared in my doorway a moment later, 2 cups of coffee in her hands. She'd clearly been listening, or at least had heard enough through the thin walls to know the conversation hadn't been pleasant. "You okay?" she asked, setting one of the cups in front of me. "I'm fine," I said, and was surprised to find it was mostly true. I thought I'd feel guilty having that conversation. Part of me expected to feel bad about refusing to help them. But I don't. Is that wrong? Patricia settled into the chair across from my desk, cradling her coffee with both hands. "When someone shows you who they are," she said quietly, "believe them the first time. Your father showed you who he was 12 years ago. Brenda showed you who she was by staying silent. The fact that they're facing consequences now doesn't erase what they did to you. Compassion doesn't require you to set yourself on fire to keep them warm." The rest of the week passed in a blur of routine work and irregular interruptions. More family members called or sent messages, each trying their own approach. Some attempted guilt, others anger. A few even tried appealing to my sense of family duty, which was almost funny given how thoroughly that family had abandoned me when I needed them. I responded to none of them. There was nothing to say that wouldn't either escalate the situation or give them false hope that I might change my mind. On Saturday morning, I took Lily hiking at Camelback Mountain, something we did most weekends when the weather wasn't murderously hot. We started early, before the sun climbed high enough to make the trail dangerous, our water bottles full and our hats pulled low against the glare. Lily chattered about school, about her friends, about a science project she was planning on desert ecosystems. I listened, letting her voice wash over me, grateful for the normalcy of it. Halfway up the trail, We stopped at an overlook that showed the valley spreading out below us, Phoenix glittering in the morning light like something precious and fragile. Lily pulled out her tablet, always documenting, always recording, and filmed a slow pan of the view. "Mom," she said, lowering the tablet and turning to me. "Some of the kids at school were talking. They said their parents saw something on the news about you buying a house from your dad. Is that true?" I should have anticipated this, should have prepared an age-appropriate explanation before she heard about it from classmates. I sat down on a flat rock and patted the space beside me. She settled next to me, her tablet forgotten in her lap. "It's true," I told her. "A long time ago, before you were born, I used to live with my father in a big house in Scottsdale. When you were a baby, he asked us to leave. We moved to our apartment in Tempe, and we've been on our own ever since. Recently, my father had trouble paying for that house, and the bank took it back. They sold it at an auction and I bought it." "Why?" Lily asked simply. I thought about how to answer that, how to explain adult concepts like justice and boundaries and the complicated arithmetic of old wounds to a 9-year-old who still believed in fairness as a simple equation. "Because I could," I said finally. "Because I've worked hard for 12 years to build a career and save money and become someone who has choices. And when I saw that house for sale, I chose to buy it. Not to be mean, not to hurt anyone, but because it was a good investment and because I paused searching for the right words. Because sometimes the things people take from you come back in different forms, and you get to decide what to do with them." "Are we going to live there?" she asked, her eyes wide with the possibility. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "Maybe. Or maybe I'll sell it to someone else. Or maybe I'll rent it out. I haven't decided. But the important thing is that it's mine now, and whatever I choose to do with it, that's my choice to make." She nodded, processing this. "Is your dad mad at you?" "Probably," I said. "But that's okay. Sometimes doing the right thing for yourself means other people get upset. That doesn't make it wrong." We hiked the rest of the way to the summit in comfortable silence, and I thought about what I just told my daughter, about choices and consequences and the complicated choreography of adult relationships. At the top, we found a shaded spot and shared the trail mix I'd packed, looking out over the city where I'd rebuilt my life from rubble, and raised a child and become someone my father had never imagined I could be. The following Tuesday, I received a formal letter from Marcus Webb requesting a meeting to discuss settlement options. The tone was conciliatory, suggesting that perhaps there was room for negotiation, that surely reasonable people could find common ground. Raymond called me after receiving his copy. "They're going to offer you a deal," he predicted. "Probably ask you to sell the house back to your father at cost, or agree to hold the mortgage yourself and let him make payments. They'll frame it as a win-win. You make your money back plus some interest, he keeps his home, everyone moves on." "I'm not interested in being his bank," I said. "And I'm certainly not selling it back at cost. I purchased an asset worth $6.8 million for $5.2. That's $1.6 million in equity. Why would I give that up?" "You wouldn't," Raymond agreed. "I just want you prepared for what they're going to propose, and for how they're going to try to make you feel bad about refusing." The meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon at a neutral location, a conference room at a business center downtown. I arrived with Raymond, both of us dressed professionally, both carrying briefcases that held documentation we probably wouldn't need, but that sent a message about how seriously we took this. Marcus Webb was already there, a man in his 50s with silver hair and an expensive suit. My father sat beside him, looking diminished somehow, smaller than he'd seemed in his own conference room the week before. Brenda was conspicuously absent, and so was Trevor. This was my father's show, his attempt to negotiate man to man, or perhaps father to daughter, though we'd never successfully occupied those roles and it was far too late to start now. Marcus opened with pleasantries, thanking us for coming, expressing his hope that we could find an amicable resolution. Then he laid out exactly what Raymond had predicted. They were prepared to offer me the full purchase price plus 10%, essentially $5.7 million, if I would agree to sell the property back within the next 30 days. This would allow my father to retain ownership, avoid the embarrassment of eviction, and compensate me for my trouble. I let him finish his entire pitch before responding. When he was done, I looked at my father, who'd been silent throughout, his hands folded on the table in front of him. "Do you understand what you're asking me?" I said directly to him, bypassing Marcus entirely. "You're asking me to give up $1.6 million in equity so you can avoid the consequences of your own financial mismanagement." You're asking me to prioritize your comfort over my financial interests. You're asking me to bail you out. My father met my eyes and I saw something there I'd never seen before. Something that looked almost like shame. I made mistakes, he said quietly. With the business, with the investments. I over-leveraged. I took risks that didn't pay off. I accept responsibility for that. Do you, I asked? Do you accept responsibility? Because from where I'm sitting, you're trying to avoid responsibility. You're trying to make your problem my problem just like you always have. That's not fair, my father said, his voice rising slightly. I'm trying to make this right. I'm offering you a substantial profit on an investment you made less than a month ago. A substantial profit that's still half $1 million less than the property is worth, I pointed out. And that completely ignores the principle of the thing. You threw me out 12 years ago. You called me nobody. You said I'd never amount to anything. Now I've amounted to someone who can buy your house, and you want me to just hand it back? Do you have any idea how insulting that is? Marcus cleared his throat. Ms. Morgan, with respect, this is a business transaction. Personal history shouldn't factor into sound financial decision-making. You're absolutely right, I agreed, turning my attention to him. This is a business transaction. And from a business perspective, your offer makes no sense. I own an asset worth $6.8 million that I purchased for $5.2. You're offering me $5.7. I'd be losing $900,000 in equity by accepting your proposal. What part of that sounds like sound financial decision-making? We could structure it as a mortgage, Marcus suggested. You hold the note, your father makes monthly payments with interest. That way you recoup your investment over time plus profit, and he retains ownership. I've seen your father's financials, I said bluntly. Morgan Development Group is barely solvent. You have outstanding liens, delayed payments to contractors, 3 projects in various stages of incompletion. What makes you think he's going to be able to make mortgage payments when he couldn't make them to the bank? Things will turn around, my father said. And I heard the desperation creeping into his voice. The market is cyclical. I have projects in the pipeline that will generate revenue. I just need time. You've had 20 years, I said. 20 years to build something sustainable, and instead you built something flashy that collapsed the moment the market shifted. That's not my fault, Dennis. That's not my responsibility to fix. So that's it, my father said, his voice hardening. You're just going to throw me out. Take everything I've built and leave me with nothing. I stood up, gathering my briefcase, suddenly tired of this performance. I'm not throwing you out. The bank threw you out when you defaulted on your mortgage. I just happened to be the person who bought the property at auction. And yes, I'm going to keep it, because it's mine legally and ethically, and I have zero obligation to rescue you from consequences you created. Raymond stood as well, buttoning his jacket. The redemption period expires in 173 days. After that, we'll expect the property to be vacated and turned over in clean condition. If your client has personal belongings he wishes to retain, we're happy to work out a reasonable timeline for removal. But the underlying transaction is not negotiable. We walked out of the conference room into the bright afternoon, leaving my father sitting at that table with his expensive attorney and his diminished dreams. Raymond said something about the meeting going exactly as expected, about them having no leverage and nothing to offer that made economic sense. I nodded, only half listening, my mind already moving forward to the practical considerations of property management and eventual occupancy. The weeks that followed settled into an unexpected routine. I went to work, managed my existing portfolio, analyzed new opportunities. Lily finished her fall semester with excellent grades and started planning her science fair project about water conservation in desert climates. Patricia and I had lunch most Fridays discussing market trends and investment strategies, occasionally touching on the situation with my father but mostly treating it as resolved, a closed chapter that required no further analysis. My father's attorney sent periodic letters, each one proposing some variation on the same theme: extended redemption periods, seller financing arrangements, leaseback options that would let my father remain in the house while technically transferring ownership. Raymond responded to each with professional courtesy and unwavering refusal. The property was mine, the terms were clear, and no amount of creative legal maneuvering was going to change the fundamental mathematics of the situation. Around Thanksgiving, I started receiving different kinds of messages. Not from family members or attorneys, but from business associates of my father, people who'd worked with Morgan Development Group over the years and apparently felt some loyalty or obligation to intervene. A contractor named Bill Martinez called my office, explaining that my father had always been fair to him, had paid on time when he could, and deserved another chance. A commercial broker named Sandra Chun sent an email describing my father as a pillar of the Phoenix real estate community who'd hit a rough patch but would surely recover. I listened to the voicemail from Bill Martinez twice, trying to find genuine concern beneath the obvious discomfort of someone who'd been asked to make an awkward call. I read Sandra Chen's email 3 times, parsing the language for anything that suggested she actually believed what she was writing versus simply doing a favor for someone who'd once done her one. In the end, I responded to neither. Their opinions, however well-intentioned, changed nothing about the legal and financial realities at hand. December brought the first real cold snap, temperatures dropping into the 40s at night, the kind of weather that passes for winter in Phoenix. I drove past the Scottsdale estate one evening, curious about whether anything had changed. The property looked exactly the same from the street, the gate still closed, the landscaping still maintained, lights glowing in the windows. For all appearances, it was still the Morgan family home, still the fortress my father had built to demonstrate his success. Only the county records knew different, and county records don't care about appearances. Lily's school held its winter concert on a Tuesday evening, a chaotic celebration of out-of-tune recorders and enthusiastic percussion. I sat in the crowded cafeteria with the other parents, watching my daughter perform a surprisingly competent version of a traditional song about snow, which none of these children had ever actually seen. Afterward, in the parking lot, she asked if we could drive somewhere to look at Christmas lights. We ended up in one of the older neighborhoods in central Phoenix, streets lined with houses that had been decorated with the kind of excessive enthusiasm that requires substantial electrical infrastructure. Lily filmed everything with her tablet, narrating her observations about color schemes and design choices, already thinking like someone who analyzed aesthetic decisions. I drove slowly, letting her capture whatever caught her eye, thinking about the strange duality of our lives. Here was this child, brilliant and observant and entirely herself, completely unaware that her mother had just orchestrated the financial dismantling of her grandfather's empire. The holidays themselves passed quietly. We'd never had family traditions that involved my father's side, given that they'd excluded us for over a decade. So Christmas was just Lily and me as it had always been. We made pancakes in the morning, opened presents that were thoughtful rather than extravagant, spent the afternoon watching movies and eating popcorn. It was simple and perfect and entirely ours, untouched by the complicated dynamics playing out in courtrooms and conference rooms. January arrived with surprising rain, the kind of sustained precipitation that happens maybe once a year in the desert and temporarily transforms everything. The dry washes filled with rushing water, the mountains turned green with winter grass, and the city seemed to exhale collectively, relieved by moisture. The redemption period was now half over, 90 days gone and 90 remaining. Raymond sent a formal notice reminding my father of the approaching deadline and requesting information about his plans for vacating the property. The response came not from Marcus Webb, but from a different attorney, someone I didn't recognize. The letter was aggressive in tone, threatening legal action for what it termed harassment, and suggesting that I was acting in bad faith by refusing to negotiate. Raymond read it over the phone, his voice amused rather than concerned. "This is desperation," he said. "They've realized the redemption period is actually going to expire, and they have no way to raise the capital to reclaim the property. So they're pivoting to intimidation, hoping you'll get scared and agree to something favorable just to make them go away." "Will they actually sue?" I asked. "They might file something frivolous," Raymond acknowledged. "But it won't go anywhere. The foreclosure was legal, the auction was proper, your purchase was legitimate. They can waste money on legal fees if it makes them feel better, but the outcome is predetermined. You own the house." A week later, I received a personal letter, not from an attorney but from my father himself. It arrived at my office in a plain white envelope, my name and address written in his distinctive angular handwriting. I stared at it for several minutes before opening it, uncertain whether I wanted to read whatever justifications or recriminations it contained. The letter was shorter than I expected, just a single page. His handwriting was less steady than I remembered, the letters slightly shaky, as if he'd written it in multiple sessions or with an unsteady hand. Jessica, it began. No dear, no daughter, just my name. I've been advised not to contact you directly, but there are things that need to be said outside the presence of attorneys and formal procedures. I won't ask for your forgiveness because I don't deserve it. I won't ask for your mercy because I have no right to expect it. What I want is for you to understand something I've only recently come to realize myself. When I told you to leave 12 years ago, I believed I was protecting my family's resources for Trevor, for his future, for the legacy I wanted to leave. I believed that you, being older and already having made what I saw as poor choices, were less deserving of support. I believed that strength meant making hard decisions, even cruel ones, if they served what I thought was the greater good. I was wrong about all of it. Trevor hasn't worked a real day in his life. Every opportunity I've given him, he's squandered. Every business I've funded for him has failed not because of market conditions but because of his laziness and sense of entitlement. Meanwhile, you, the daughter I threw away, built something real. You survived what would have destroyed someone weaker. You raised a child alone while building a career that made you successful enough to buy my house out from under me. The irony isn't lost on me. I'm not writing to change your mind about the property. I understand that legally and practically it's yours. I'm writing because I need you to know that I see now what I couldn't see then. You were never nobody. You were always the strong one, the capable one, the one who would have made me proud if I'd been wise enough to look. I failed you as a father, and I failed myself by not recognizing your worth until it was demonstrated in the most painful way possible. I don't expect you to care about my regrets or my belated understanding. You've already shown that you don't need my approval or validation. But I wanted you to hear it anyway. Not because I think it changes anything, but because it's true, and truth is something I should have valued more highly all along. Dennis. I read the letter 3 times, searching for manipulation or hidden agenda, for some strategic purpose beneath the words. But it seemed, as much as anything could coming from my father, genuine. Not an apology exactly, because he was right that he didn't deserve forgiveness and had no right to ask for it. More an acknowledgement, a recognition of reality that he'd spent 12 years refusing to see. I filed the letter in the folder with all the other documentation related to the property, legal proof and personal confession sitting side by side, and went back to work. His recognition changed nothing about the situation, but it did settle something I hadn't realized was still unsettled inside me. I didn't need his approval, that was true and had been true for years. But knowing that he finally understood the magnitude of his mistake, that he could see clearly what his cruelty had cost him, that provided a kind of closure that no court decision could have delivered. February brought word that my father had listed the Morgan Development Group for sale. It was covered in the local business press, framed as a strategic restructuring rather than a desperate liquidation, but I could read between the lines. He was dismantling everything, selling off projects and properties, trying to raise capital for something. Raymond thought he might be trying to pull together enough to redeem the house at the last minute, though the numbers made that unlikely. Even if he sold everything, the debts and obligations would consume most of the proceeds. Patricia asked me one afternoon what I planned to do with the property once I took possession. It was a practical question, one I'd been avoiding answering even to myself. The house was worth substantially more than I'd paid, but it was also large enough to be impractical for just Lily and me. I could sell it immediately, take the profit, invest in something more manageable. I could rent it out, though finding tenants for a 6,000 square foot luxury home was its own challenge. I could live in it, claim the space my father had denied me, let Lily grow up in the kind of house I'd been expelled from. I don't know yet, I admitted. Part of me wants to sell it and be done with the whole situation. But another part thinks there's value in keeping it, in transforming it into something different than what it was. Like what? Patricia asked, genuinely curious. Like proof, I said slowly, the idea forming as I spoke. Proof that you can take something built on cruelty and exclusion and transform it into something else. Something open, something generous, something that demonstrates values opposite to the ones that created it originally. She nodded thoughtfully. That's ambitious. Also possibly therapeutic. Just make sure you're doing it because it's what you actually want, not because you're trying to make a point to someone who may never understand it anyway. The redemption period entered its final month. Raymond sent a formal 30-day notice as required by law, informing my father that if the property was not redeemed by March 23, He would be required to vacate by April 1st. The notice was professional and procedurally correct, containing no emotion or commentary, just dates and legal obligations. My father's response came through yet another attorney, the fourth one he'd retained since the foreclosure. This one was younger, aggressive in a way that suggested he'd been hired specifically to make noise rather than to accomplish anything substantive. He filed a motion claiming that the redemption period calculation was incorrect, that various notifications had been defective, that the entire foreclosure process should be reviewed for irregularities. The court scheduled a hearing for early March, giving my father's attorney an opportunity to present his arguments. Raymond was unconcerned. "They're throwing things at the wall," he said. "None of it will stick, but they're entitled to their day in court. We'll show up, present our documentation, and the judge will dismiss it. Theater, nothing more." The hearing took place on a gray Thursday morning, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain but hadn't yet delivered. The courtroom was nearly empty, just the judge, the court reporter, Raymond and me on one side, my father and his attorney on the other. Brenda sat in the gallery, her face carefully composed, her hands folded in her lap. Trevor was conspicuously absent, probably still in bed or simply uninterested in the legal minutiae of his father's downfall. My father's attorney, whose name was Jordan Ellis, presented his arguments with considerable passion but little substance. He claimed the foreclosure notices had been sent to an old address, that my father had never received proper notification, that the timeline for redemption had been calculated incorrectly. Raymond methodically dismantled each claim with documentation, certified mail receipts, photographs of notices posted on the property, calculations that showed the redemption period had actually been extended beyond the statutory minimum. The judge, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and an expression that suggested she'd seen every possible variation of legal desperation, listened with obvious patience wearing thin. When Jordan Ellis finally concluded his presentation, she didn't even pause before ruling. "Motion denied," she said crisply. The foreclosure was properly noticed, the auction was conducted according to law, and the redemption period was calculated correctly. Mr. Morgan has until March 23 to redeem the property, or until April 1 to vacate. This court sees no basis for extending that timeline or revisiting the underlying transaction. We're adjourned. The gavel came down with a sound of finality, and I watched my father's shoulders slump slightly, the last thread of hope visibly severing. He didn't look at me as we filed out of the courtroom, didn't acknowledge my presence at all. Brenda followed him out, her heels clicking on the marble floor. And for a moment I felt something that might have been sympathy before remembering all the times she could have spoken up and chose silence instead. Outside the courthouse, Raymond shook my hand. "That's it," he said. "The legal challenges are exhausted. The redemption period will expire in 2 weeks, and the property will be fully yours with no encumbrances. Congratulations." I drove back to my office feeling strangely hollow, as if the victory I just secured should feel more substantial than it did. Patricia was waiting with coffee, and the kind of knowing look that suggested she understood exactly what I was feeling without needing me to explain it. "Justice doesn't always feel good," she said, echoing something she told me months ago. "Sometimes it just feels like the end of something that should have ended a long time ago." The final 2 weeks of March passed in a suspended state, waiting for a deadline that felt both inevitable and slightly unreal. I made arrangements with a property management company to handle the transition, hired cleaners to prepare the house for whatever came next, scheduled inspections to document its condition. These were practical tasks, logistical necessities, but they felt weighted with significance I couldn't quite name. On March 22, the day before the redemption period expired, I received a phone call from an unfamiliar number. When I answered, it was Trevor, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. "Jess," he said, and the use of my nickname caught me off guard. I just wanted to say. He paused, searching for words. "I wanted to say that I get it now. Why you did this. I mean, I'm still mad about it, but I get it. Dad screwed you over and you had the chance to screw him back and you took it. I probably would have done the same thing. This isn't about revenge," I told him, though I'd lost track of how many times I'd said those words and to whom. "This is about a property that went into foreclosure, and I bought it because it was a sound investment." "Yeah," Trevor said, and I could hear the disbelief in his voice. "Sure. Just a sound investment. Nothing to do with Dad calling you nobody and throwing you out 12 years ago. I didn't respond to that because what was there to say? Of course it was about that, at least partially. Pretending otherwise was dishonest, but admitting it felt like giving Trevor ammunition for his narrative about vindictive sisters and family betrayal. Anyway, he continued, we're moving out tomorrow. Dad found a rental in Tempe, which is kind of funny when you think about it. Full circle, I guess. I just wanted you to know that I'm not going to give you any trouble about it. I'm done defending him. He made his choices and they led here, and that's not your fault. He hung up before I could respond, leaving me staring at my phone and wondering if that was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever get from my younger brother. Probably. Trevor wasn't built for introspection or genuine remorse, but acknowledging reality was at least a step in some direction, even if it wasn't quite the right one. The next day, March 23rd, came and went without drama. No last-minute redemption, no attempts to delay or defer, just the quiet expiration of a legal timeline. The property was mine, fully and finally, with no conditions or contingencies remaining. Raymond sent a formal notice to my father confirming that the redemption period had closed and requesting confirmation of move-out plans. April 1st fell on a Saturday, warm and clear, the kind of perfect spring day that makes Phoenix livable between the winter cold and summer heat. I drove to Scottsdale with Lily beside me, her tablet ready to document whatever we found, my heart beating faster than the situation warranted. The gate to the estate stood open, the bronze M still gleaming in the morning sun, and I pulled into the circular driveway for the first time in over 12 years. The house looked smaller than I remembered. Or perhaps I was just larger, my perspective changed by time and experience. The front door was unlocked, and I pushed it open slowly, stepping into the marble foyer that had once seemed so grand and now just seemed excessive. The furniture was gone, the walls bare of the art that had hung there, the space echoing with emptiness. Lily walked through the rooms with her tablet raised, filming the high ceilings and large windows, the fireplace that dominated the living room, the kitchen with its commercial-grade appliances. This is huge, Mom, she said, her voice carrying in the empty space. Did you really live here when you were young? For a while, I told her, walking through the house and cataloging what remained. A few pieces of furniture too large or too damaged to move. Some boxes stacked in the garage containing things my father apparently didn't want but hadn't bothered to discard. In his study, the room where he'd stood backlit like a deity pronouncing judgment, I found the collection of photographs I'd requested. They were in a cardboard box, unsorted and unprotected. Photographs from my childhood mixed with more recent family portraits. I knelt beside the box and began sorting through them, looking for images of my mother, who died when I was 16 and whose face I sometimes struggled to remember clearly. There she was, young and smiling, holding me as a baby. There she was again, at my 8th grade graduation, her hand on my shoulder. There were pictures of me at various ages, school photos and family gatherings, evidence of a life before the divorce, before Lily, before my father decided I was disposable. At the bottom of the box I found something unexpected. A photograph of the 4 of us, me, my father, Trevor and Brenda, taken maybe 15 years ago. We were standing in front of the house, all dressed up for some occasion I didn't remember. My father's hand was on Trevor's shoulder, his expression proud and proprietary. Brenda smiled her practiced smile. And I stood slightly apart, not quite part of the group but not entirely separate either, my expression uncertain, as if I already knew I didn't quite belong but hadn't yet accepted what that meant. I showed the photograph to Lily. That's your grandfather, I said, pointing to my father. And your uncle Trevor. And this is me when I was about 23. You look sad, Lily observed, studying the image on the glossy paper. I told her. I just didn't know it yet. We spent the rest of the morning walking through the property, inside and out. I showed Lily the pool where I used to swim laps in the early morning before the heat became unbearable, the guest house where Trevor had lived rent-free for years, the garden that had once been meticulously maintained and now showed signs of neglect. She filmed everything, her young director's eye finding angles and perspectives I wouldn't have thought to look for. In the afternoon, Patricia arrived with a bottle of champagne and an expression of mild amusement. Thought you might want to toast your new acquisition, she said, holding up the bottle. Or perform some kind of ritual cleansing to purge the negative energy. Whichever feels more appropriate. We sat by the empty pool, the 3 of us, drinking champagne from disposable cups while Lily explored the yard with her tablet. Patricia asked the question I'd been asking myself for weeks. So what now? You've won. You've got the house, you've got the vindication, you've proven everything you set out to prove. What comes next? I looked at the house, this massive structure built to demonstrate wealth and status, sitting empty and waiting for me to decide its purpose. I thought about selling it, taking the profit, walking away clean. I thought about living in it, claiming the space I'd been denied, letting Lily have the kind of childhood I'd been expelled from. I thought about transforming it into something else entirely, something that served a purpose beyond personal occupation or financial gain. I'm going to turn it into a resource center, I said, the idea crystallizing as I spoke it out loud. For women rebuilding after divorce, single mothers trying to get back on their feet, people who need a temporary safe place while they figure out their next steps. I'll renovate it, create private spaces and common areas, bring in counselors and financial advisors and career coaches. I'll call it, I paused, thinking, the second foundation. Because everyone deserves a chance to rebuild on solid ground. Patricia raised her disposable cup in a toast. That's either the best idea I've ever heard, or the most expensive form of therapy available. Possibly both. We clinked our cups together, the plastic making a dull sound instead of crystal's ring, and I felt something shift inside my chest. Not the hollow victory of the courtroom, not the grim satisfaction of boundaries enforced, but something warmer and more forward-looking. Purpose, maybe. Or possibility. Lily came running back from the far end of the yard, her face flushed with excitement. Mom, there's a whole citrus grove back there. Oranges and lemons and grapefruits, all growing on trees. Can we keep them? We can keep whatever you want, sweetheart, I told her. This is ours now. We get to decide what stays and what changes. That evening, as the sun set over the McDowell Mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple that only desert sunsets can achieve, I stood on the patio of my father's former estate and thought about the strange mathematics of inheritance. I hadn't inherited this house through family legacy or parental generosity. I'd acquired it through foreclosure and auction, through my own capital and capability, through becoming someone formidable enough to buy what had once been used to demonstrate my worthlessness. But in a way, I had inherited something from my father, just not what he'd intended. I'd inherited his lesson about cruelty, about what happens when you discard people based on your own narrow definitions of value. I'd inherited his demonstration that appearances matter more than substance to some people, and that eventually, the foundation crumbles when it's built on nothing solid. I'd inherited his template for what not to become, what not to value, what not to teach my own daughter about worth and belonging. And I transformed that inheritance into something different. Into resilience, into capability, into the understanding that being called nobody by someone small doesn't make you actually small. Into this moment, standing on land I owned, planning to create something generous from something that had been built on exclusion. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from a number I didn't recognize, but the message made the sender clear. The house looks good empty. Better than it ever looked full. Take care of it better than I did. Take care of yourself better than I did. Dennis. I read the message twice, then deleted it without responding. There was nothing to say, no words that would bridge the gap between what he'd done and what I'd become despite him. Some distances are too great to cross, some damage too deep to repair. That's not tragic, just true. The renovation of the estate took 6 months, transforming what had been a monument to one man's ego into something that actually served people who needed it. I hired contractors who understood the vision, architects who could reimagine the space without destroying its bones, designers who knew how to create environments that felt safe rather than impressive. The master bedroom became an administrative office. The guest house converted into counseling rooms. The formal living and dining areas transformed into communal spaces where residents could gather, share meals, support each other through the difficult work of rebuilding lives that had fallen apart. Lily was involved in every decision, her tablet always recording, her questions always insightful. She suggested painting the walls in warm colors instead of the cold whites and grays my father had preferred. She advocated for a garden where residents could grow vegetables, claiming her science project on water conservation had taught her about desert agriculture. She drew floor plans for a children's play area, understanding without being told that women rebuilding their lives often had kids who needed safe places to be kids. Patricia helped with the financial structuring, setting up the second foundation as a nonprofit organization with sustainable funding models. We secured grants from foundations focused on women's economic empowerment, partnered with local businesses willing to provide job training, connected with universities that could offer educational pathways. It was complex work, requiring expertise I didn't fully possess, but I'd learned over the years that not knowing how to do something wasn't the same as being unable to learn. By October, the renovation was complete and we'd hired staff. A director named Monica Fletcher who'd spent 20 years working in social services and understood both the practical and emotional dimensions of helping people rebuild. 2 counselors, one specializing in trauma recovery and the other in financial literacy. A case manager who'd coordinate resources and connect residents with services beyond what we could provide directly. And a handful of support staff who'd handle daily operations, maintenance, meals, all the logistics that made a place function. Our first resident moved in on a rainy Tuesday morning. A woman named Angela Wright with 2 daughters aged 6 and 8. She'd left an abusive marriage with nothing but a garbage bag of clothes and a determination to create something better for her children. Her story was different from mine in its particulars but similar in its essence. Life had knocked her down and she was clawing her way back up, and she needed time and space and support to make that climb. I met Angela on her first day, showing her the suite of rooms that would be hers for the next 6 months while she completed a nursing program and saved for her own apartment. She walked through the space slowly, touching the walls as if confirming they were real, her daughters following close behind. "This is really ours?" she asked, her voice uncertain. "For 6 months we can just live here without worrying about rent or being thrown out." "This is really yours," I confirmed. "You'll be expected to participate in the programs we offer, work with your case manager on goals and timelines, contribute to the household through chores and shared responsibilities. But yes, this space is yours. You're safe here." Angela's face did something complicated, relief and disbelief and gratitude all tangled together, and I recognized the expression because I'd worn it myself years ago when I'd finally found stability after the chaos of divorce and displacement. She thanked me 3 times, her voice breaking, and I told her what I wish someone had told me back then. "You don't have to thank me for treating you with basic human decency. That should be the baseline, not something extraordinary." By December, the second foundation housed 8 residents, women at various stages of rebuilding. Some were fresh from crisis, still raw and uncertain, moving through the space like they expected it to disappear at any moment. Others were months into their journeys, visibly stronger, starting to make plans that extended beyond simple survival into actual futures. They cooked meals together in the kitchen that had once hosted my father's business dinners, their laughter echoing through rooms that had been designed for impressing clients rather than nurturing community. Lily spent time at the center after school, doing homework at the communal table, playing with the younger children, occasionally filming small documentaries about the residents who agreed to share their stories. She was growing up surrounded by women demonstrating resilience, learning lessons I couldn't have taught her through lectures or instructions. She was learning that strength comes in many forms, that rebuilding is possible, that community matters more than square footage. One afternoon in mid-December, while I was reviewing budget projections in my office at the center, Monica knocked and told me I had a visitor. I looked up from the spreadsheets, confused. I hadn't scheduled any appointments, and donors usually coordinated through Patricia rather than showing up unannounced. The visitor was my father. He stood in the doorway looking diminished in ways that went beyond physical stature. His suit was still expensive but no longer perfectly pressed, his shoulders curved forward slightly, his face carrying lines that seemed to have deepened in the months since I'd last seen him in court. He held a manila envelope in both hands, gripping it like it was anchoring him to something. "Jessica," he said quietly, "thank you for seeing me. I know I have no right to be here." I gestured to the chair across from my desk, not trusting my voice to remain steady. He sat carefully, like someone uncertain of his welcome, and placed the envelope on the desk between us. "I heard about what you've done with the house," he said, his eyes moving around the office that had once been his master bedroom. "About the foundation, the women you're helping." He paused, searching for words. "It's remarkable. It's exactly the kind of thing your mother would have done if she'd had the resources." The mention of my mother caught me off guard. A sharp, unexpected ache in my chest. "We didn't talk about Her often in our family, her absence a wound that had never quite healed. Her memory something my father seemed to prefer avoiding rather than honoring. Mom believed in helping people, I said carefully. She believed that having resources created obligations, that privilege should be deployed toward making things better for those with less. She did, my father agreed. I used to think that was naive, that the world didn't work that way, that you had to protect what was yours or someone would take it. He laughed bitterly. Turns out I was right about the taking part, just wrong about who'd be doing it. I didn't take anything from you, I said, the old argument rising automatically. You lost it through your own financial mismanagement. I simply purchased what the bank put up for auction. I know, he said, raising a hand to stop me. I'm not here to refight that battle. You were right legally and morally. I lost the house because I made bad decisions, over-leveraged, prioritized appearance over substance. That's on me. I accept that now, even though it took losing everything to understand it. So why are you here? I asked, genuinely curious. What do you want, Dennis? He pushed the envelope across the desk toward me. Inside that are the titles to 3 properties I still own. Small parcels, nothing like the estate, but they're paid off and unencumbered. Together they're probably worth around $400,000. I want to donate them to the Second Foundation. Not as some kind of payment or apology, just as, he struggled again with words, as my contribution to something that matters. Something your mother would have supported. I opened the envelope and pulled out the documents. 3 properties in different parts of the Phoenix metro area. A small commercial building in Glendale, a vacant lot in Mesa, a duplex in South Phoenix. I could see immediately how they might be useful, the commercial space potentially converted into satellite services, the lot sold for operating capital, the duplex providing transitional housing for residents ready to move toward independence. This is generous, I said slowly. But I need to understand your motivation. Are you trying to buy forgiveness? Trying to ease your conscience? Trying to repair our relationship? All of those things probably, he admitted. But mostly I'm trying to do something right for once. I spent my whole life building monuments to myself and all of them collapsed. You built something for other people and it's standing. I want to contribute to that, even in a small way. Even if you never forgive me, even if we never have any kind of relationship, I want to support what you've created here. I studied his face, looking for manipulation or hidden agenda, for some strategic purpose beneath the apparent sincerity. But he just looked tired and old and genuinely humbled in a way I'd never seen before. This wasn't the Dennis Morgan who'd thrown me out 12 years ago, who'd stood backlit in his study pronouncing judgment. This was someone who'd been broken by consequences and was trying to figure out how to be something other than what he'd always been. I'll accept the donation, I said carefully, but only if it's clean. No strings, no expectations, no claims on your part that this creates any kind of relationship or obligation between us. You give these properties to the Second Foundation, they belong to the organization, not to me personally. You don't get access to residents' information, you don't get publicity or recognition, you don't get to feel like a hero. You just get to know that you did one decent thing. Agreed, he said immediately. All of that is fine. More than fine. I pulled a legal pad from my desk drawer and started making notes about next steps. I'd need to have Raymond review everything, ensure the transfers were properly structured, coordinate with our board about accepting assets from someone connected to me personally. It would take time and careful handling, but the properties could genuinely help expand our capacity to serve more women. My father watched me work, his expression unreadable. When I looked up, he was staring at the walls where I'd hung photographs from the Second Foundation's first months. Residents cooking together, children playing in the garden Lily had designed, women at counseling sessions and job training workshops. Visual evidence of lives being rebuilt, of the transformation of space that had been meant for exclusion into something that practiced inclusion. You did this without me, he said quietly. Without my help, without my money, without my name. You did this because of what I did to you, not in spite of it. He stopped, his voice catching. That's the part one can't quite process. I tried to break you and instead I made you stronger. You didn't make me anything, I corrected firmly. You created circumstances I had to survive. I made myself stronger because the alternative was letting you be right about me. But don't confuse cause and effect. You don't get credit for my resilience just because your cruelty was the obstacle I overcame. Fair enough, he acknowledged. I just want you to know that I see it now. I see you clearly, probably for the first time. And he paused one final time, then said it simply. I'm proud of you. I know I have no right to that feeling. No, it means nothing coming this late. But I'm proud of what you've built and who you've become. The words landed strange and complicated. A gift I'd once desperately wanted but no longer needed. I didn't thank him. I didn't tell him it meant something or that his pride mattered. I just nodded acknowledgement and went back to my notes about the property transfers, treating his emotional confession as less significant than the practical logistics of expanding our mission. He left 20 minutes later, walking out of the office that used to be his bedroom in the house that used to be his kingdom, getting into a 10-year-old sedan that replaced the luxury car he used to drive. I watched from the window as he pulled away, thinking about the strange mathematics of justice and mercy, about how sometimes the people who hurt you most end up diminished not by your revenge but by their own choices catching up with them. Monica appeared in my doorway after he'd gone. Everything okay? She asked. That looked intense. My father, I explained. He wanted to donate some properties to the foundation. That's complicated, she observed mildly. Everything about family is complicated, I agreed. But the properties are legitimate and useful. And whatever his motivations, they'll help us serve more women. So I'm choosing to focus on that rather than on the emotional complexity of accepting something from someone who once threw me away. The weeks leading up to Christmas were busy with programming and planning. We hosted a holiday dinner for residents and their families. The dining room that had once been reserved for business meals filled with the chaotic joy of children and the tentative laughter of women beginning to believe things might actually get better. Lily helped organize a gift drive, coordinating with local businesses to ensure every child had presents under the tree we'd set up in the common area. On Christmas Eve, after the residents had gone to their rooms and the staff had left for the night, I walked through the house alone, taking inventory of the transformation. Here in the foyer where I'd stood 12 years ago with my boxes and my baby and my father's cruelty still ringing in my ears, there was now a welcome desk and a wall of photographs showing every woman who'd passed through our doors. Here in the study where my father had pronounced me nobody, there were filing cabinets full of case files documenting real people building real futures. I found myself in the kitchen where that long-ago Sunday dinner had taken place, where Alicia had announced she wanted my little house and my parents had revealed through their silence that they'd already decided my fate. The room looked completely different now, industrial appliances instead of luxury showpieces. A large table that seated 12 instead of the formal dining set designed for impressing clients. But the bones were the same, and standing there, I could almost hear the echo of that conversation, the moment I'd understood that blood didn't guarantee belonging. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. Merry Christmas to my favorite real estate mogul/nonprofit founder. You've done something extraordinary this year. Your mother would be proud. I typed back a thank you, then added, I think she'd be more proud of the women we're helping than of me specifically. She always cared more about impact than individual achievement. True, Patricia replied. But she'd also be proud that you turned your father's cruelty into something constructive. That's alchemy, Jess. That's transformation in its purest form. I locked up the house and drove home to my apartment, the one I still lived in because moving into the estate had felt wrong somehow, like claiming victory rather than creating service. Lily was already asleep, exhausted from days of helping prepare for the holiday celebration. I stood in her doorway watching her breathe, this person I'd raised alone, this child who'd never known her grandfather as anything other than a distant figure who'd once hurt her mother, and I felt grateful for that distance. She would grow up different than I had. She would grow up knowing that strength came from building things rather than defending them, that security came from capability rather than family name, that belonging was something you created through choice and action, rather than something owed by blood. She would grow up watching women rebuild their lives and understanding that resilience was ordinary rather than exceptional, that everyone deserved chances to start over, that home was something you made rather than something you inherited. The new year arrived with unexpected rain, storms rolling through the desert and transforming the landscape temporarily into something green and lush. The second foundation continued its work, residents cycling through, some succeeding in their rebuilding, others struggling and needing extended support, all of them teaching me new dimensions of what it meant to help versus rescue, to support versus enable. In February, we held our first graduation ceremony for a cohort of residents who'd completed our 6-month program and were moving into independent housing. Angela Wright was among them, now working as a nurse at a hospital in Tempe, her daughters thriving in their schools, her future no longer defined by what she'd escaped but by what she was building. She spoke at the ceremony, her voice strong and clear, about what the foundation had meant to her. "I came here with nothing," she said to the assembled residents and staff and donors. "I'd left a marriage that was killing me slowly, and I had 2 kids and no plan and about $500 to my name. I thought I was nobody, that I'd made such bad choices that I'd never be able to fix my life. But this place, these people," she gestured around the room, "they didn't treat me like I was broken. They treated me like I was building. There's a difference. And that difference saved my life." I watched from the back of the room, tears running down my face that I didn't bother to wipe away. This was why. This was the answer to every question about whether confronting my father had been worth it, whether buying the house had been vindictive, whether transforming it into a foundation had been practical. Angela Wright standing there strong and employed and hopeful. That was worth every complicated feeling, every difficult conversation, every moment of doubt. After the ceremony, Monica pulled me aside. "We've been contacted by a reporter from the Phoenix magazine," she said. "They want to do a feature story on the second foundation, about the work we're doing and the women we're helping. They're particularly interested in your story, about buying your father's house and turning it into this." I felt my stomach tighten with resistance. I'd carefully avoided publicity, keeping my name out of most foundation materials, preferring to let the work speak for itself rather than making it about my personal narrative of revenge or redemption or whatever frame people wanted to put on it. "I don't want this to be about me," I told Monica. "I don't want some feel-good story about the daughter who got back at her mean father by doing something noble. That's not what this is." "Then tell them what it is," Monica suggested gently. "Control the narrative instead of letting others define it. Talk about the work, about the residents, about the model we're building. Your story is part of it, but it doesn't have to be all of it." I agreed reluctantly to meet with the reporter, a woman named Jennifer Hale who'd covered nonprofits and social services for years, and approached the story with genuine curiosity, rather than looking for cheap drama. We talked for hours over multiple sessions, walking through the house while I explained the renovation choices, sitting with residents who agreed to share their experiences, reviewing financials and outcomes data that demonstrated impact beyond anecdote. The article ran in April, a thoughtful 10-page feature that balanced personal narrative with broader analysis of housing insecurity, domestic violence, economic vulnerability. It included my story but didn't center it, treating my conflict with my father as context rather than climax. The response was immediate and substantial. Donations increased, volunteers contacted us offering time and expertise. Other cities reached out asking about replicating the model. My father sent a text after the article published. "You're doing remarkable work. I'm grateful I could contribute to it even in a small way." I read the message 3 times, then archived it without responding. We'd achieved something like détente, a careful distance that acknowledged shared DNA without pretending to be a relationship. He donated his properties, which had indeed been valuable for expanding our capacity. I'd accepted them and used them well. Beyond that, there wasn't much to say. Trevor reached out that same month, asking to meet for coffee. I almost declined, unable to imagine what we had to discuss after all this time. But Lily asked about her uncle when I mentioned it, curious about this person who existed in her family tree but not in her actual life, and I found myself agreeing to meet at a cafe in downtown Phoenix. He looked different than I remembered, less polished somehow, wearing jeans and a t-shirt instead of the designer casual where he'd favored when living off our father's money. His face had thinned, his manner was less entitled, and when he spoke, there was something approaching humility in his voice. "I've been working," he said after we ordered coffee. "Actual work, like a real job with a boss and hours and a paycheck that comes from my own effort. It's strange and kind of exhausting, but also," he paused, searching for words. "Also kind of good. Like I'm finally doing something real instead of just coasting on Dad's name." "What kind of work?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Real estate, actually," he said with a slight smile. "Turns out I absorbed more than I thought from growing up around it. I'm working with a property management company, handling maintenance calls and tenant issues. It's not glamorous, but I'm learning the business from the ground level up instead of starting at the top and never understanding how anything actually works." We talked for an hour, Stilted at first but gradually more natural. Two people who'd grown up in the same house but barely knew each other trying to find some kind of connection. He asked about Lily, about the second foundation, about my work. He told me about his apartment in Mesa, about the girlfriend he was dating who had no idea about the Morgan family drama, about his attempt to build something separate from our father's shadow. I wanted to apologize, he said as we were getting ready to leave, for how I treated you back then, for the things I said in that meeting with the lawyers, for not understanding what Dad did to you until I experienced a much smaller version of it myself. What happened? I asked. Dad cut me off, Trevor said simply. After he lost the house, after he had to downsize and sell off parts of the business, he told me it was time I stood on my own feet. No more money, no more bailouts, no more pretending I was running companies when I was really just playing at being important. He said I needed to figure out who I was without his name and money protecting me. It was brutal and probably overdue. How do you feel about him now? I asked, curious whether Trevor's perspective had shifted as dramatically as his circumstances. Complicated, Trevor admitted. Angry, grateful, resentful, understanding. All of it mixed together. He was a terrible father in a lot of ways, but forcing me to grow up might be the best thing he ever did for me, even if it came 20 years too late. We parted with an agreement to stay in touch, though neither of us was quite sure what that would look like. We weren't close and probably never would be. Too many years of distance and different treatment to bridge easily. But we were adults now, both shaped by the same flawed parent in different ways, both trying to build lives defined by our own choices rather than his expectations or his money. Summer arrived with its punishing heat, temperatures climbing above 110 most afternoons. The kind of weather that drives everyone indoors and makes the whole city slow down. The second foundation installed shade structures in the garden, created an afternoon activity room for children to escape the heat, adjusted programming schedules to avoid the worst hours. Life continued, women arriving and departing, children growing, small victories accumulating into meaningful change. Lily turned 10 in July, and we celebrated at the foundation with residents and staff, the kind of party I'd never been able to afford in those early years when every dollar was allocated to survival rather than celebration. She'd requested donations to the foundation instead of gifts for herself, which made me simultaneously proud and worried that she was growing up too aware of others' struggles, too conscious of privilege and responsibility. Mom, she said that evening as we drove home, tired and sun-worn and happy, do you think Grandpa Dennis understands what he lost when he made you leave? I thought about that question, about the calculations of loss and gain, about whether my father's belated recognition constituted understanding or just regret. I think he understands he lost the house and the business and the life he'd built, I said carefully. Whether he understands what he lost with me specifically, with the chance to know you, with the relationship we could have had, that's harder to say. Some people only understand loss in material terms. That's sad, Lily observed. Having stuff isn't the same as having people who matter. No, sweetheart, I agreed. It's not the same at all. By September, the second foundation had served 43 women and 61 children in its first year of operation. We'd helped 32 women secure employment, 27 move into stable housing, 17 enroll in educational or training programs. The numbers were modest compared to the scale of need, but each one represented a life trajectory altered, a family stabilized, a future that looked different than it would have without intervention. Patricia and I sat on the patio one evening, reviewing year-end financials and planning for expansion. With the properties my father had donated, plus additional fundraising and some strategic partnerships, we could potentially open a second location, extend our programming, serve more women. It was ambitious, possibly overreaching, but also exactly the kind of challenge I'd learned to meet. You've built something extraordinary, Patricia said, closing her laptop and looking at me directly. From nothing, from actual destruction, you've created something that generates hope and possibility. That's not just business success or nonprofit achievement. That's transformation. That's alchemy. I felt the weight of her words, the recognition of what had been accomplished not just by me, but by everyone who'd contributed, residents and staff and donors and volunteers. The second foundation wasn't mine alone, even though it had started with my money and my house and my history. It belonged to everyone who'd passed through it and everyone it had helped and everyone who'd believed in its mission. My phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was thin and uncertain, older than I expected. Is this Jessica Morgan? The woman asked. I'm calling about the second foundation. I saw the article and I wondered if she paused, gathering courage. Wondered if you might have space for someone who's 63 and starting over after a 40-year marriage ended, and there's nowhere else to go. I gestured to Patricia that I needed to take this, walking away from the patio into the quiet garden where Lily's vegetable plants grew in neat rows despite the heat. Tell me your story, I said gently to the woman on the phone. Tell me what you need and where you are and what starting over looks like for you. She talked for 20 minutes, her voice strengthening as she went, telling me about a marriage that had slowly suffocated her, about adult children who were too busy with their own lives to help, about savings that had been controlled by a husband who'd left her with nothing when he finally departed. Her story was different from mine in every detail but similar in its fundamental shape. Someone who'd been told she was nothing. Someone who needed time and space and support to become something different. Someone who deserved a chance to rebuild. We have space, I told her when she finished. We have a room that's available now, and we have programming that can help you figure out next steps. When can you get here? Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.